All right, everyone, welcome. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Emma Harbour, and I'm the Director of Outreach for the Duke UNC Consortium for Middle East Studies. And on behalf of all of my colleagues in the Duke and UNC Area Study Centers, we welcome you to our first webinar in our International Education Week series. We are so glad that you are joining us this week to celebrate global education and our broad theme of exploring human rights and social justice around the world. And we're very honored that our consortium is hosting this first webinar focused on the Middle East and North Africa. And thank you all again for joining us. So we are in a Zoom meeting, as you all know. I'm glad you could meet us here. We have just a couple of reminders on using Zoom meeting. Because we're in a meeting and not a webinar, we ask that you keep yourself muted during the presentation. You can find that mute button in the left-hand corner of your screen. And to improve internet connectivity for all, we'll ask that you actually keep your video off during the presentation to increase the audio and visual quality, especially for our speaker who today is in Tunisia. So we're going to help Shreya as much as we can in ensuring that her internet stays stable, inshallah. We will have some breakout room conversations at the end, and so we welcome you to turn on your video at that point. But for now, please do keep it off. But to engage in conversation, so we're not all just floating names, we encourage you to use the chat box to ask questions for our speaker to answer throughout the presentation and in the Q&A section. So I saw you all typing in the chat where you're from. I think we have people from Switzerland, and I know, Ronnie, maybe you live in Durham now, but initially from Belgium. So we welcome all. We're so glad that so many people were interested in exploring this topic tonight. Just a few other housekeeping notes before we begin with our presentation. A certificate of completion for continuing education credit will be distributed by the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction by January 31st for your attendance at this webinar. Do stay until the end so that you can take a brief survey that is required to be counted for your attendance. So make sure that you stay until the end of our presentation today. We have a quick survey for you to fill out about your experience. And presentation slides, as well as a recording of this webinar, will be available to all participants sometime next week. We are hosting this series for International Education Week in collaboration with the Department of Public Instruction, their Global Education Steering Committee, and we're so grateful to have their support and collaboration in planning this really exciting week of webinars as we travel around the world, a different part of the world every night to talk about different themes related to social justice and human rights. And we are thrilled to have a quick video welcome from the Department of Public Instruction.
Good evening, teachers and educators. My name is Christy Day, and I serve as the Assistant Director for K-12 Standards, Curriculum, and Instruction at the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction. On behalf of the Global Education Steering Committee at DPI, it is my pleasure to welcome everyone to the International Education Week webinar series, Social Justice and Human Rights Around the World. On November 5th, 2020, the North Carolina State Board of Education declared November 16th through 20th International Education Week. International Education Week is an opportunity to celebrate the benefits of international education and exchange worldwide. This joint initiative of the U.S. Department of Education and the U.S. Department of State is part of the effort to promote programs that prepare Americans for a global environment and attract future leaders from abroad to study, learn, and exchange experiences. International Education Week offers the chance to expand awareness of and interest in global issues and global learning, collaborate with and learn from international student groups, gain a new cultural understanding, and sample a small part of life beyond the shores of America. This is our second year celebrating International Education Week at DPI and our second year partnering with the UNC-Duke Area Studies Centers to provide a professional learning series on global education. We are so grateful to have them as collaborative partners who seek to ensure that educators in North Carolina are globally engaged, aware, competent, and responsive. This week-long professional development webinar series aims to increase awareness of social justice and human rights around the world. Each evening this week, you'll have an opportunity to attend an interactive webinar which focus on content and resources related to a specific world region: Africa, Asia, Europe, Latin America, and the Middle East and North Africa. Such sessions will address the complexity of challenges faced in the world, introduce issues from multiple viewpoints, and illustrate solutionary thinking. By addressing human rights and social justice, these webinars provide educators the opportunity to engage in examination of our world and think critically about the underlying causes of embedded and interconnected problems, preparing teachers to address issues of global significance in the classroom. In addition to the global series, a variety of activities are in the works at DPI to promote and celebrate International Education Week in North Carolina. In September, members of the Global Education Steering Committee began sharing global education resources on social media. This will continue through this week. These resources can be found on our International Education Week webpage. A Day of Celebration webinar has been recorded, shared, and posted. This webinar highlights global education efforts across North Carolina. The IEW, or International Education Week Students Showcase, provides students an opportunity to share their interests and understanding of global issues, global learning, and cultural awareness through various projects, presentations, or work samples. The COVID-19 pandemic has given us an opportunity to rethink and redesign education, and DPI wants to acknowledge all the ways our North Carolina students and educators are studying global education in the digital age. Thank you for your commitment to North Carolina students and their continued journey of global learning. Enjoy tonight's session.
All right, and I mentioned in the chat, while this video is focused on North Carolina, and we're thrilled to be partnering with the Department of Public Instruction. We are so glad to have teachers from across the country and actually across the world joining us this evening, and hope that your state is similarly doing celebratory programming in honor of International Education Week. Oops, let's go to our next slide. So regardless of where you are, in addition to earning an hour and a half per webinar that you attend in this week-long series, we also have several options for you all to gain additional professional development hours if you like. There are three options. One is recording a Flipgrid reflection and classroom activity. One is a recorded interview, and the third option is a collage. These are just ways for you to extend the learning experience beyond the webinar this evening. Again, they are completely optional, but we wanted to provide ways for you all to continue to engage with this content in a meaningful way and hopefully help think proactively about how you might incorporate this material into your classes that you teach, while also earning credit for it. So I'll go over these very briefly. These slides, again, will be made available to you after this evening so that you can see these options more in depth and decide whether or not you might have time, perhaps over the holidays when hopefully your schedule is a little more manageable and you might have time to process. So the first option, as I mentioned, is to submit a 1.5-minute Flipgrid video responding to a few reflection questions. And again, just going through these briefly because this will be made available for you to read after this evening. Option 2 is a recorded interview in which you interview a student, global education colleague, member of the Area Studies Committee, so the center's putting on this webinar series, a person from another country, etc., about what the connection between global education and social justice and human rights means to them. And then the third option is to create a collage of images using at least 6 different pictures that represent your takeaways from tonight's session or any other sessions this week in this series. So this is a fun visual activity that you can engage in if you wish. To learn more about all of these options, we have a short hyperlink for you, go.unc.edu/IEW-CEU, and I will put that link in the chat shortly. So you have more information about any of those options in case you would like to earn additional professional development credit for your time as learning part of this International Education Week. So with that, I'm thrilled to introduce our speaker, Shreya Parikh, who is a PhD candidate in sociology and politics at both UNC-Chapel Hill and is now in a dual program with Sciences Po in Paris. She's currently in Tunisia. She made it there despite all of the COVID-19 barriers and is currently a Global Religion Research Initiative Fellow funded by the University of Notre Dame and Templeton Foundation. Her work is so intricately connected to issues of social justice and human rights around the world and examines the social construction of race, especially Blackness, and the context of Tunisia and France. She'll also be speaking about Lebanon this evening. And she's especially interested in how these social constructions come to be contested and challenged both locally and at a global level. And with that, Shreya, we're so thrilled to turn it over to you.
Hello, everyone. This is completely an honor for me to be here, sort of speaking to all of you from all parts of the world. It's midnight here, so my brain might die at some point, so please bear with me, like my internet. So I'm going to give you a brief introduction of like my trajectory, my personal, like, just to give you a brief idea of like where I stand and like how I'm approaching the work I'm doing. And then I'm going to shut down my video just to help the internet flow of things. I get very excited when I speak. So please, if you feel like you really have a question, put it in the chat, and Emma's going to be looking at the chat box, and she will shout at me if the question requires me to urgently stop and respond to it. So please feel free to, chat, put your questions in the chat, put your comments in the chat, and Emma will be looking at it. So just to give you a brief introduction of who I am. So I grew up in India until I was 19, 20, and then I moved to France to study about the Middle East. The reason I did that was because I grew up in Ahmedabad in India, which is in the Northwest. And we have had a lot of contestations between Hindus and Muslims in my city while I was growing up. So that sort of pushed me to think about questions of like Islamophobia. What does that mean? What does it mean for us to live together or not live together? And so, this has sort of pushed me to go and study about the Middle East. And then I spent a year in Lebanon at the American University of Beirut. Moved back to France, and then I moved to UNC-Chapel Hill to do my PhD, to start my PhD in sociology. And now I'm here in Tunis. It's wonderful to be here. You can move the slide, Emma. So I'm going to give you a brief. So this is the gorgeous view. A picture I took very recently of the gorgeousness of Tunis. So I'm in Tunis to do the first part of my research, data collection. I'm looking specifically at the construction of Blackness here. So the construction means not only just like how people construct it and racialize them and marginalize this population that comes to be called Black, but also how these people who feel marginalized sort of contest it and question this thing that comes to be called Blackness. Okay, I'm going to stop my video right here, so it's easier. So this is sort of what I'm looking at. So I'm looking at activists and folks who define themselves as Black, and how do they sort of, what are the experiences they're having about Blackness. That is sort of what I'm doing. So now what I'm going to be speaking about in this lecture, in this talk, in this discussion, I hope it's more a discussion, is about the ways in which racism gets manifested and contested within the Arab world, and how we are going to try to connect it to the more broader global racism. Already, so the question, what is the Arab world, right? What comes to our head when we talk about the Arab world? You can move the slide. Emma, you can move the slide. Thank you. So Arab world, it's again a form of political construction at this point. It is the countries, like when we talk about it academically, we talk about countries who are part of the League of the Arab States that was founded in 1945. These countries have over years come together and become a part of what we call the League of Arab States. And so that is sort of like the academic definition of what we mean when we use the term Arab world. Of course, this does not mean that folks who are living in these countries define themselves as Arab, as I will talk about more. Than the Arabness is a contested term within this region, and not everyone feels Arab in the same way. Okay, we can move. So how is Arab world different from MENA, what we call the MENA, the Middle East, or the Muslim world as, terms. We can move. So MENA stands for Middle East and North Africa. It's again like sort of an academic term, but you also find it in like, when you read news and stuff. This again, is used to define a set of like a geographical location. The Middle East is a funny term, like, it's middle of the East, like it's the east of who, and it's the middle of the east of the what, right? So that is a question that sort of comes up. So of course it's a term that, comes to be used when most of the world is colonized, mostly by Britain, but also by France. So what we call Middle East is the middle of their east, the eastest being India at that, during that period, and sort of it's in the middle. And North Africa, we sort of, it's sort of used as a separate category because North Africa, what we call today North Africa, was mostly colonized by France. So Tunisia, where I am right now, was a French ex-colony. Okay, we can move on. The Muslim world. This is a term that, I've spent many hours and hours thinking, what do we mean when we talk about the Muslim world? So this is a question for folks. You can, put it in the chat. What countries do we find, in which countries do we find the highest population of Muslim faith? I'll give you 1 minute, and folks are going to you have to try to, put the list of like the 3 highest countries with Muslim population in the world today. Okay, so folks have responded. Anyone for the second guess, for the second country with the highest? Yes. Okay, so we have the list here. Emma, you can move. Okay, so Indonesia, of course, is the first. The data I have here is from 2015. Indonesia has all this giant amount, has the largest Muslim population in the world. And what's funny is that when we think about the Muslim world, we never think of this part of the world. Okay, we can move, Emma. The second is India. Third is Pakistan. Fourth is Bangladesh, and the fifth is Nigeria. So what I find very strange and funny and as well in this list is that in the top 5 countries are not in the so-called Middle East or the so-called Arab world. But this is not the only definition of the Muslim world, right? I mean, Muslim world gets also used to define the diaspora today. When we talk about the Muslim world, we can also it also refers to the Muslim diaspora, the folks who migrated from these parts of the world to US, to France, and stuff like that. But also folks who are living within these countries and who are like who either converted to Islam or were introduced to Islam. It's also like the indigenously Muslim populations of many parts of the world. Okay. So today I'm going to be specifically talking about 2 countries very close to my heart, one of which I'm currently living in, which is, so we are going to talk about Tunisia. Yes, there we are, between Algeria and Libya, in what we call North Africa. And then I'm going to be also talking about Lebanon, which is just sort of, yes, right over there. We can move this. I have a better map. Here, there we go. So as you can see, Lebanon is north of Israel-Palestine, sort of, surrounded by Syria and Jordan. Okay, we can move. So migration, like when we think of this region, what comes to our mind is, the diaspora from the Arab world. We think of migration to France, we think of migration to the US, to Canada, to Australia. But what doesn't come to our mind is that the place itself, the Arab world itself, is also a host to migration. we can move. So as I said, people also moving in and out, not just today, but also historically. And I'll sort of talk about that because that is also linked to manifestations of racism and contestations of Arabness of the Arab world. Okay. So here's an example of Tunisia, right? In the end 19th century, for example, Tunisia received a significant wave of migrants from Italy. When you talk to people here sitting in Tunis, and they're going to tell you about like the amount of words spoken in the Tunisian Arabic dialect that come from Italian. So this is like one of the manifestations of this migration link that we have here with Italy. And today we have a lot of migration from sub-Saharan Africa into Tunisia. Folks are coming in as, guest workers, as, transit migrants who are attempting to head to Europe, and also students. So you have this mix of migration from sub-Saharan Africa. And Tunisians themselves also migrating, elsewhere to like France, for example, to parts of Europe. So, it's not just one way of flow from here to outside, but it's also, the other way around. We can move. So, the example of Lebanon, in Lebanon, we host a lot of domestic workers from Ethiopia, Sri Lanka, Philippines, Cote d'Ivoire, Mali, Senegal. But that's not just the only population we have. We also have refugees, from Palestine, from Iraq, from Syria, from just the neighboring parts of the world. Yeah, so it's, like when you think of this region, it's a mix within itself. And, when you talk about the Arab world, it's always used in this like cliches of terms, but we never really talk about, the very complex demography of this space. And I think that is something that we should always remember. Okay, we can move. Does anyone have any questions so far? I can give you like a minute, just if you want to post a question, just reflect on what you've been thinking. If you have like a funny story about migration in the region, feel free to type it in. Like when I think of this region, like I always think of the Mediterranean, which sort of connects it to Europe, which connects it to the world. And if you stop looking at this region just as spaces of lands, but as as something that is connected by this water body, I think it makes more sense to think of like the historical movement that the sea created between this whole region, not just this region, but also with Europe, with the outer world. So someone has raised a question of why Syria was suspended out of the Arab League. It was after the war. It was due to it's because of the crisis that is happening, the political crisis in Syria. Yes, so you do have someone has raised a question about Palestinian Africans or African Palestinians in Jerusalem and their solidarity with BLM. Yes, you have mixed. You have Black folks with African ancestry everywhere, in every part of the world. We have it in India. We have them in India. You have them in Palestine and in Israel, in Lebanon. And you also have folks who are, who have had ancestry years and years ago and are completely, whose parents have grown up in, for example, in Tunisia, right? There have been a lot of migrations before Tunisia was created, before 15th century, during 15th or 16th century. And this population, we cannot say that, they are very, very much Tunisian as everybody else. So you have a lot of mixture of people and these are people who are also speaking back to the global movement of BLM, and we'll talk about that. Okay, so if you have more questions, just pop it in and I'll try to respond. Okay, so this is the more theoretical fun part. As a sociologist, I love talking about this. So one of the things, I was trained in France for a part of my academic journey, and I'm still being trained in France for a part of it. And there's been a lot of, you know, questioning of like, can we actually talk about race because of the whole history of, you know, how race was used in Europe during the Holocaust period. So there's been a lot of queasiness in the academic use of the category race. So when we talk about race, I think we need to be very clear that we're talking about race not as not on the biological basis, but rather as a social construction. So when we talk about it sociologically, we talk about it as a social construction. We can move. And that, and like, so how can you say that it's a social construct and it's not based on any biological basis or anything, universal and solid? So, a race assigned to one person does not remain constant, for example, all across all the societies. So for example, if a person who's seen as Black, who self-identifies as Black in the United States moves to, for example, Brazil, it is possible that this person does not get seen or perceived as Black, but maybe like, a mix or potentially even white, right? So how a person, like the race that is assigned to a person, is dependent completely on the society where the person is located, as well as the context in which the person is located. I have funny stories when I would be walking around Paris and I get perceived as a Hispanic person, as an Indian person. So, it's again, like based on the context, like how you get identified. So hence race as a social construct. It's socially dependent, it's socially created. Okay, we can move. So the question that comes up is, it's like, if it's as, sometimes when you raise the point that race is a social construction, folks tend to banalize it, right? Being like, if it's just a social construction, if you say it's not biological, so why should we even study it? Just because it's just a social construct, why should we study it? So the reason, we can move. So the reason for studying race as a social construct is because I'm sure all of you are very aware of this, is because race as a social construct has real implications on the lives of the people. And, it marginalizes a set of population by not just differentiating them, one from another, but putting them in a hierarchy. And I think this is also a question that comes up, like, if it's just a difference, you can just be different. The example I use here is like, apples are different from oranges. It's like apples exist, oranges exist, but that's just difference. But this is more than a difference. I think what race as a social construction does is puts people in a set of hierarchy and defines a certain set of people as more, like, as superior, sometimes as better in the society, and gives them a set of privileges, and while at the same time it marginalizes a set of population. Okay, so I wanted to give you a few examples of like race as a social construction within Tunisia and Lebanon. So recent interview I did with Mariam, a female migrant worker from Ivory Coast. She recounted to me, horrifying stories of her ex-employer from Tunisia, who would comment continuously about her smelling bad, right? So, just because of her skin color, folks, her employer used to think, or her ex-employers used to think that she is, she doesn't bathe herself enough, or she smells bad, she doesn't know anything about personal hygiene. So this is a stereotype that I've also heard recurrently among, from folks I've interviewed, not only here in Tunisia, but also, folks I've encountered in India, where these kind of ideas circulate. Folks have met and spoken with in Lebanon, who are racialized, who are marginalized. So this odor is something, like, again, like if you were to like have a scientific, these are social constructions. These are things that people imagine socially and assign to a set of population. So here in Tunisia, you also have the use of terms, right? Like, derogatory terms like receive, like slave. It's like an equivalent of the N word here. And abid, which is also, also means slave, to designate a Black person. And this is used, I've argued, a lot of folks argue that these terms are neutral, and that they use it just to just have fun. But then, these terms, when you speak with the people who feel marginalized by this, it's clear that, you're creating a form of social hierarchy by defining a set of people as inferior, as potentially slave, or as oppressed. You also have stories of Black Tunisians who are assumed to be non-citizens, right? And this question of citizenship, like who can be considered a citizen within this, so-called Arab world. So Blackness apparently is seen as something contrary to Arabness. And so when, so in spite of their, citizenship of them being born here, their parents and grandparents and great-great-great-grandparents being born in this region, Black Tunisians are still get comments like, oh, go back to your country. We can move. Okay. So these examples that I gave from Tunisia are examples of what we call interpersonal racism, right? It's from an individual to another. And this is something that comes up a lot in everyday interactions. And this we differentiate from structural racism, which is racism that we define as institutionalized, which exists in the society. Okay, so structural racism, I mean, I spoke about it, it's institutionalized. So it exists in the society as institutions, so we have prison systems, we have education system that perpetuates racism, we have the courtrooms, the legal system that also perpetuates racism in many cases. And this is so I'm going to give you examples of that. We can move. Okay, so structural racism. So I'm going to give you an example from Lebanon, which I find very fascinating, but it's also a partly sad story. In Lebanon, for the migrant workers, the system that is put in place is called the kafala, or the sponsorship system. Where migrant workers are allowed.
And Shreya, we have lost you again.
I think I'm back.
You are definitely back.
Okay, so the kafala, I'm sorry for this. I think my internet is gonna keep doing this maybe sometimes. Okay, so the kafala system requires that the migrant worker have a contract with the employer. So what happens when the employer is being just terrible, just purely terrible, and the migrant worker wants to change jobs? So this does not, if the migrant worker, the domestic worker terminates the contract, the legal status has been terminated. So the kafala system, what it does is it, targets a certain set of population that is already marginalized, right? So it's not just about the migration law, because you have a completely different set of laws that, that fall under the labor, so the contract that is signed when migrant workers come into Lebanon does not fall into the normal so-called the category of labor contract. So when the contract gets terminated, migrant workers cannot seek help or protection from the state, right? So this, so when you try to think of like the population that gets targeted by this total state marginalization, you see that, it's a very specific population that is already being marginalized within Lebanon because of interpersonal racism. And it's already a very marginalized population, socioeconomically, in terms of legal power, in terms of their, status within, as in their socioeconomic status. And hence, there has been an argument has been made that kafala itself is a manifestation of structural racism in Lebanon. There has been very recently, an attempts at changing this form of law contract, but just very recently, the reform was denied. The reform to change the kafala system was denied, unfortunately. Okay, we can move. So we're going to stop here for some self-reflection. What links can you identify between manifestations of racism in Tunisia and Lebanon with that in the US? So we talked about different ways in which racism gets manifested in Tunisia and Lebanon. Can you think of ways in which you see such similar things in the US? You can type that in the chat, take a minute for yourself, and then we can talk from that. I'll pick like 2 examples. Let's go. Great. There's this very interesting point being raised here about links between the persistent desire to determine who is from here and who is not, right? And I mean, this constant comments that Black Tunisians get to go back to their country, whatever that country is, right? In the social imagination, like who is considered a citizen and who is not considered a citizen based on phenotypes. And, that's also a form of racism. And that gets manifested in the US as well, who is considered, a citizen who is not considered racism. So you have a lot of Islamophobia that directly puts to question the citizenship of Muslims living, not just Muslims, but also folks who get categorized as Muslims, their citizenship to question. Right, yes. Like how all construction workers get called Mexicans, where Mexicans is a social, racial construction. Okay, yes, great. So these are all very, very great points. I'm very glad everyone is making mental connections. This is, in spite of my weird internet connection, I'm glad I'm passing some knowledge somehow to all of you. Great, okay. Please keep typing in the chat, that keeps me excited. And I'm going to keep going. Okay. So as as what we were doing here is trying to make connections between what's going on in the Arab world and what is going on in the US. And if you were to use this as a strategy to talk about racism in your classroom, I would just put in a cautionary note in that I think you should always say that, when we talk about the Arab world, this racism is not just happening in the Arab world, but also in the US, in India, in, just many parts of the world. Mostly because if you were to talk about racism just in the Arab world, it would come to be associated with already a lot of negative stereotypes that we have in the US about the Arab world. So I think just making this comparative connection, this is not just something that exists in the Arab world, but also in the US, I think that would help sort of limit additions to already pretty bad amounts of stereotypes that exist about the Arab world. Okay, we can keep moving. So speaking back against racism, this gets me very excited, mostly because, it puts to question the very destructive socioeconomic inequalities that do exist in the society. And so, that's always been a challenge for me to sort of theorize, to understand, like this, we have a lot of violence that exists within our society that is a result of, the socioeconomic inequalities, the racial inequalities, the gender-based inequalities that exist in the society. But yet, we managed to find enough optimism and a desire for justice to keep fighting, to keep fighting this racism, to keep fighting inequalities. And these are not just group actions, right? I mean, when we imagine speaking back against racism, we think of BLM, we think of, giant marches on the streets in Paris, in Tunisia. But that is not just, that's one form of manifestation of challenges to racism. You have micro level of challenges that are taking place every single day, at every single moment in our lives, in people's lives. And that is something I'm going to try to reflect on. So what are some ways, I mean, as I said, you have activism, protests, and marches that are very politically and socially visible acts of resistance. Okay. Here's a gorgeous picture of Saadia Musbah, who's a very fantastic Black Tunisian activist, very militant. She's in the protest for the 2018 in the aftermath of the Arab revolutions that we had here in 2011 that resulted in the toppling of an authoritarian regime. So once this authoritarian regime was gone, a lot of folks found it easy to communicate whatever they, there was a lot of curbs to freedom of expression before. And there was a very singular definition of what it means to be Tunisian. And once the revolution happened, folks felt freer, to talk about, feeling not represented by the government, feeling not represented by the definition of Tunisian, what in French we call it Tunisianité. And right, I mean, I'm seeing in the chat that the question is, it's like, this placard is in French and it's not in Arabic. And there's a whole politics of language that goes on as well, because, Arabness that has come to sort of make Black Tunisians feel marginalized, right? And Arabic comes to be associated as a language that is also the language of Arabness, that is linked to Arabness. So there's some level of rejection of Arabic language among certain groups of Black Tunisians, and especially Black Tunisian activists. So there's this whole politics of, contested Arabness that takes place within the Arab world, and language is one way in which this form of contestation takes place. So great point. Thank you for raising that question of language. We can move. Oh, I wanted to take, so here's also, from a similar march, also in Tunisia. Here it reads in both Arabic and French, La lil Ansariye, no au racisme. So, no to racism. It's, this was a sub-Saharan African migrant march organized in Tunisia for more rights and more respectability. And this activism has led to concrete things, right? So since 2011, we had manifestations and a lot of activism, political activism, that led to the passing in 2018 of a law that decriminalizes racism, racial discrimination. And now there has been, slow attempts. So this is, this is something concrete that we have been able to achieve because of, political activism, marches, just being politically and socially visible. But, the success of this law also requires this individual acts of resistance, right? So if no one is going to file any cases, this law is going to be useless. So you have today, militant groups who are, talking with people and asking them, have you faced, racial discrimination? Would it be possible for you to potentially, if you have experienced it, file a case at the police so that we can, create a set of, a form of, solid ways in which the state can finally consolidate the ways in which the law that is already passed can be applied, right? So there's still this distance between what has been passed and what can be applied at this point. And this the application requires individual level efforts. So someone is raising the question of Amazigh, the Amazigh population in North Africa, and that's a whole different story, and I would be very excited to talk about it. Right now, I'm going to concentrate very much on Blackness and construction of Blackness and contestation of Blackness within the region. But I'm very, very happy to talk about these things. Feel free to email me. I'm happy to set up a chat, and we can go from there. Okay, we can keep moving. So for those who are not, they just briefly mentioned about Amazigh. So the Amazigh group is what is, are the people who define themselves as the indigenous population of North Africa. And they have their own set of languages, their own set of ways of rituals, festivals, ways of dressing, and a lot of that has influenced the way in which for example, the language in Tunisia, the Arabic dialect that is spoken also incorporates a lot of words from the Amazigh dialect. Anyway, so heading to the question to get you more excited, what links can you identify between acts of resistance against racism in Tunisia and Lebanon that we sort of briefly saw, and what you have seen in the US or Belgium or Switzerland or wherever it is that you're located? We'll take a minute to pause and think and reflect. Feel free to type in the chat. So I'm looking at a bunch of posts about protests. Can you think of other ways in which you have noticed resistance to racism or challenges to racism? If someone has raised art, there's a lot of the art also gets used here in Tunisia, in Lebanon, and in the region to put to question the sort of inferiorization and marginalization of Black culture. So there's there's a reclamation of Blackness and a reclamation of African ancestry. And a form of pride that is, bestowed to the art that comes to be associated as Black. So the song we played very much at the beginning, Lama Yasmar Duni, it is a Tunisian song. It's a song that the story that is recounted to me is that. It's a song of pride that was sung as a celebration. It was a song that was sung during the period of the abolition of slavery in Tunisia. That was in 1846. And the song sort of asks, it's a child who's asking his mother, why is it that why does darkness mean, something ugly? Why does it mean something bad? And that song in the recent months, because of the global movement, has been reused as a form of pride. So the song you saw, if you look at the video itself, there are a lot of Black Tunisian artists, a lot of Black folks who live within Tunisia who are showcased as, like we take it as a pride. Anyway, I'll let you think and reflect about that, and we can always come back to that, and we can keep moving for now. Alrighty, global movement against racism. I mean, again, like we had, when we think of BLM, the thing that comes up is, oh, maybe it's US, right? But BLM sort of inspired a global, or events in the US inspired a global questioning of racism, both structural and interpersonal. And post Floyd's murder and the uprisings in the US, there was a march for Black Lives Matter organized in Tunis. And so here's a picture from that. I mean, sort of what I wanted to highlight here is that it's, when you talk about race and racism from within the Arab world, from France or other parts of the world, one of the argument that you get is you're sort of importing, like what I get a lot is like, Shreya, you're importing US American ideas and putting them in France or putting them in Tunis or, putting them in Lebanon. But that is not the case, right? I mean, as you can see in these protests, people are coming up and telling and recounting their own very personal stories of feeling marginalized, feeling racialized. So racism or race as a social construct is not quote unquote like an American import, right? So it's something applicable everywhere. So sometimes you might get that kind of pushback from folks when you speak about racism. So this is a tactic you can use, right? That indeed folks from within these regions you are speaking back with their own testimonies of racism. So of course, I mean, it's not. You cannot just dilute it by saying it's an American import. Okay, we can keep moving. I mean, if you have anything you would like to add or say, if you feel inspired by that image, just feel free to type in the chat. And I'm going to move into more like strategies for talking about racism. Sort of, this is again a moment for me to self-reflect, for us to self-reflect. So how does one talk about racism, right? This is a question I ask myself multiple times. And okay, let's move. So the strategy that I have used for myself, and again, like this speaks more about who I am as a person, and the position that I occupy, which is, I'm from India. I work on the Middle East, on the Arab world and France, and I'm studying in the US. So my personal, and I teach mostly, when I do teach, I teach university level students. So this is my personal tactic. Of course, like we can talk and you can discuss about how this can potentially be applied in classrooms that you're teaching, for whatever level of, whatever age group you're interacting with. So my strategy has been self-reflection and then use of personal stories. I start with self-reflection and I reflect on my positionality. So when I say positionality, it means, who am I, right? I mean, what is the position that I occupy in the society, right? What are my privileges? What are not my privileges, right? What is leading to my marginalization? So, when I reflect on my positionality, it's clear that I'm a brown person. Sometimes it's clear that I'm Indian, sometimes it's not. it's clear that I'm a woman. I mean, again, gender is also social construct. I mean, these are all social constructions, right? Borders are social constructions, nations are social constructions, sociopolitical constructions. What else? So I have an Indian citizenship, and I grew up in a middle-class Hindu family, which determined how I grew up a lot, like the privileges I had, the caste group that my last name indicates, which also falls within a privileged caste, So these are the things that I try to reflect on, like my own positionality. And I think of, when is it that have felt marginalized within the society? When is it that I've potentially contributed to somebody else's marginalization or racism, right? And I do that by having an intersectional approach. And this is sometimes a scary word for people, like intersectional approach. I mean, something very, very simple and beautiful. It just means that you try to look at all these factors all at the same time, right? You look at your gender, your social class, your education, your citizenship, your perceived racial identity or your perceived ethnic identity. And you try to see like how they all sort of combine to give you a very specific experience of being racialized or being marginalized, but also like, how you could potentially contribute to marginalization. So like I tell a lot of my own personal stories. So, thinking about marginalization. So when was it that I felt interpersonally marginalized? So when I was in Lebanon, I was perceived as a domestic worker because of my gender and my skin color. But the way I move, the way I carry myself as a body, because of my middle class upbringing as well as my education, it means that the way I move in the society, just like plain walking, right? The clothes I wear, the way I speak, it indicates very clearly that that I'm potentially not a domestic worker. So, right, so how that played into my marginalization. And then I try to also think of ways in which I might have contributed to racism, or I might have contributed to somebody else's marginalization. And I've been thinking a lot of my childhood recently, because I was growing up in a city and within a social and within a society that is highly Islamophobic. And I remember very much cornering with my friends in a classroom when I was probably 13, with my other Hindu upper class friends. We cornered a fellow Muslim student, and the reason and the excuse we gave was that this person smelled bad, right? I mean, again, this question of smell comes up, right? Like how smell gets used to differentiate and construct somebody as inferior, and how this comes to be associated with Muslimness in India, but not just in India, right? I mean, this is something that you would see in a lot of different parts of the world. So this, this complex set of, experiences, I'm sure everyone has had these very, very complex experiences in their life. Like, how does this personal complexity help us understand not just how racial marginalization is experienced, but how also racial marginalization is imposed on somebody else, right? So I'm going to end with that note. This is how I usually do it. This is potentially something that can be used in a classroom with 13-year-olds or like 10-year-olds. And Emma, could you move this slide? I think the next one is the last one. No, we can go. Okay, so what I'm going to do is now take questions before we move to the activity, which is, again, we are going to use the same set of self-reflection questions and try to see if that works for you or not. Anyway, I'm going to stop here, stop speaking, and let you ask me questions. We're going to take about 5 minutes. Please type your questions, and as I see questions coming up, I will try to respond. as much as I can. And of course, you can always, always email me. Okay, so where do domestic workers come from in Lebanon? You have quite a few from South Asia, some from Philippines, quite a lot from Sub-Saharan Africa. And it's weird because you have within this domestic migrant group also categorization, like, it's within that group, it's also racialized. So for example, if you're like a rich Lebanese family, you're going to hire a Filipino domestic worker. And if that is beyond your means, you would try to get someone who's South Asian. And if that is beyond your means, you would try to get someone who's like Ethiopian or Malian or someone from Senegal. So it's just like very complex. So when we speak of like racialization of domestic workers, it's not homogeneous, and it's very complex. Like gender plays a role into how racism is also manifested, right? So, for example, when just like sexualization, right, of race as well. So, for example, a lot of Black Tunisians and Black folks here in Tunisia have told me about how when they're walking in the street, like women folks are walking in the street, they get called out as prostitutes, and sort of men act in ways with them that sort of indicate, where it's clear that they assume that Black bodies, quote unquote, are more, quote unquote, available, right? So this idea of like promiscuity is attached to Black women bodies here. And this is not just here. This is also in Lebanon. This is also in India. Another question that comes up is, do people in the countries of origin know that their relatives are experiencing high levels of racism in Tunisia and Lebanon? If so, why do people continue to migrate? I think that's a great question. Migration, when people do migrate, it's always, it's full of optimism. Stories do circulate, but it's a weird full of censorship that also takes place, right? So for example, folks who are here, they don't want to give they don't want to tell to their families clearly that they are not living in heaven, because they have put in so much money, so much effort into leaving everything behind and coming and moving here. So the Tunisia that they want to portray when they speak, when they communicate with their families in Senegal or Cote d'Ivoire or wherever, they want to give a more rosy image, mostly for their own, it's their own self-esteem is at stake in these conversations. So there's some knowledge, but not a complete knowledge of the level of racism and racial violence that these folks are experiencing. So another question is, do you find that conversation about race are more sensitive in any particular country or region of the world? I think race is politicized everywhere in the world. Of course, the way it gets politicized is very different. It's manifested very, very differently, but no one wants to talk about it. It's very clear. I mean, it's different ways of like not wanting to talk about it. So wherever in the world you want to talk about race or racism, you will encounter a lot of pushback and a lot of resistance, mostly because it puts to, when you do talk about race, when you do talk about racism, it puts to question a lot of privileges that people have, a lot of assumptions based on which they move in the society, on which their comforts are based, on which their social links are based. It's just difficult in every part of the world. So you saw the image of Saadia Musbah, a very prominent Black Tunisian activist who founded NEMTI, which means my dream, an association fighting for fighting against racism, fighting for recognition of the fact that racism does take place in Tunisian society. And so the association was created in the post-revolution Tunisia, where everyone was very hopeful. Everyone was just, wanted to dream about, a plural Tunisia. And what happened, so, in the post, around like 2013, 2014, that spirit, that hope, that, form of optimism sort of began to die. But, Saadi Musbah has been, very persistent in the work she's been doing. She has not been pessimistic about her work at all. I mean, on the contrary, she's put in all her efforts, all her, financial, physical, mental energy into fighting against racism. Currently, she is, every time I speak to her, she's always like, oh, I need to go meet that person so that I can force, I can like sort of help this person file a case at the police station. Because, there's certain, like every part of the world, there's certain imagery that is attached, certain form of fear that is attached to the police. And especially if you're a woman, if you're a migrant woman worker in Tunisia, it's such a precarious position to have. And, if you want to, it just adds to layers and layers of messiness. And so, there's Sadia, she's going to be like, no, I'm going to come with you and we're going to do this, so if you ever want to find inspiration to talk about racism, she's a figure. Very strong person, and you can try. And I've been doing a lot of interviews with her for my dissertation, just to understand how she moves and how she gets the energy. Okay.
Shreya, could you put her name in the chat?
Of course.
If people would like to research her or use her work as a study in their classroom.
I will tell her that I spoke about her, and if you ever need to get in touch with her, I'm happy to put you all in touch with her. She's a very, very lovely person. Okay, I'm going to try to go to questions. Do you find that Tunisia or other North African countries identify as Arab rather than African, perhaps because of the idea of Blackness? I think that's a really great question. I'm going to speak. So Arabness is assumed, right? It's like, how whiteness is assumed and we never name and talk about whiteness. I think that it's something similar that is going on with Arabness here. So when I do ask people, like non-Black Tunisians, like, do you identify as Arab? They're like, no, of course I don't identify as Arab. I'm Arab Tunisian. So it's like, it's like, you just told me you don't identify as Arab, but you told me that you identify as Arab Tunisian. Or sometimes folks are just like, oh, I just identify as Tunisian. But then once you dig into what does it mean to be authentically Tunisian, the Arabness comes up, in the first sentence. So in terms of like self-identification, what is the content of Tunisianness? What is the French term is Tunisianité. What is the content? There's Arabness. There's always the presence of France as an ex-colony that they are always trying to speak back to. There's, because everyone is dreaming about migrating or have folks who have migrated or have families that have migrated to Europe. So there's a desire for a Mediterranean identity. That's how they call it. And there's a complete, in the most mainstream discourses of Tunisianity, there's a complete rejection of the Africanity or the links to that the fact that they are in Africa. So a story that Saadia recounted to me was, when she was sort of, challenging one of her professors, and the professor, this is all happening in Tunisia. The professor was like, oh, I have never been to Africa. And then Saadia just laughs and she's like, well, where are you standing right now? Like Tunisia is Africa, right? it's this idea like Africa is seen as something like, far away, sub-Saharan Africa, quote unquote, not civilized, with people who smell, these are the ideas that sort of circulate. Again, this is like social construction of self and social construction of the other. So this is how, this whole thing comes to be constructed, with all these stories of like genealogies, or, stories of genealogies of like, people coming. So it's funny, sometimes I ask people like, oh, what's your, what is your genealogy? What is your ancestry? They're like, oh yeah, like my ancestors came from Saudi Arabia. They're Arabs, probably Arabs. Or sometimes, sometimes people do talk about the Amazigh, like their roots and, from Amazigh groups as well. But then they're like, oh no, I'm not completely Amazigh, but also Arab. So the Arab genealogy does get used for sort of, gaining privilege, for sort of putting oneself, locating oneself more higher in the social hierarchy. The Amazigh groups in Tunisia are sort of define themselves and see themselves differently from Morocco and Algeria. So there's like a whole different set of politics about that, which is different. But you do have groups within Amazigh groups that do feel marginalized, and they sort of speak back as well. And Amazigness is not, again, like when you talk about Tunisianity or Tunisianness, Amazigness is not included in that definition, in the mainstream social political definition. Let's see, more questions. I love questions. Assume dichotomy between Arabness and Blackness. Yes. So you have folks who define themselves as both Arab and Black, right? You do have that. Where they're comfortable saying like, my ancestry, some part of my ancestry is potentially from, from Libya maybe, or south of Algeria or Mali or something like that. But I also have ancestry here in Tunisia, so I'm Black and Arab. But so you have these people who self-identify as Black and Arab, but within the social construction of Arabness, Blackness is defined as the other, as the inferior, yes. So when you talk about Arabness here, when you talk about Tunisianness here, Blackness is not included, but on the contrary, it is defined as something that is the other, right? So as I was saying, like how a lot of Black Tunisians get questioned, like, oh, are you like, go back to your country, just ask like to go back to their country. I think that indicates very clearly the sort of dichotomy of like who is a citizen and who's not a citizen, and the citizen being someone who quote, sort of looks whatever Arabness means here, right? So someone is saying this helps explain why my friend from Egypt does not identify as African American, while I can trace my ancestry back to Africa, but am considered African American and Black. Yes, you have that because of like how nationhood, the ideas of nationhood or ideas of like national identity were created in, colonial period, as well as, pre-colonial and post-independence periods within these spaces.
So Shreya, this is a fascinating discussion. I'm so glad that you're getting so many questions. I think for the sake of time, we should probably move on for our last 5 minutes for conversation in small groups.
Yes.
And then we'll come back together for some final announcements, and don't forget to stay until the very end so that you receive your link to fill out your survey for continuing education credit.
Right.
Oopsies.
Okay. So did you get?
Hold on just a moment. I had a sharing screen issue.
No worries. I can just like sort of narrate what we're going to be doing next. It's a bit of an activity where you're going to be put into breakout rooms, and you're going to, sort of introduce yourself, what you do, what type of classes you teach, and try to think about whether self-reflection and use of personal stories is a strategy you could use or you would be comfortable using in your classroom, or what other kinds of strategies you could use while talking about racism within your classroom. And if, using examples from somewhere that is not your own society can help sort of stimulate self-reflection and aid ways in which hard topics can be discussed. Voila. So Emma's going to go ahead and put you all in breakout rooms, and we can come back and.
Yes, thank you so much, Shreya. So
You're welcome.
so the breakout rooms are open. You should have a notification on your screen to go ahead and join them in small groups of about 4 or 5. We'll have about 5 minutes for open discussion about the presentation, and then we will come back together again for some final announcements. And that will be the end of our webinar. If anybody has any issues joining the breakout room, please feel free to send me a message in the chat. All right, Shreya, I think everyone's back.
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for being here. It was a pleasure. I wish this could be done, in person, but then you wouldn't have me from Tunisia. Anyway, I mean, just the last few words would be like, if you have ever any questions for me, feel free to email me anytime, and I'm always happy. Like, if you ever want me to attend your class or like speak about, racism in the Arab world or something like that, I'm happy to do that. And yeah, I mean, if someone has any reflections that they would like to share from your discussion, please feel free to chat about it. I think
oh, go ahead, Shreya.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to sort of like end on a reflection note about like why use external examples sort of to stimulate self-reflection. I think for me, just as, getting out of India and studying about the Middle East and, other parts of the world has helped me a lot to see just the very complex ways that discrimination and marginalization takes place in India, right? So like every time I'm thinking about Tunisia, I'm also thinking about India in the same way and trying to sort of, find links with my own experiences with things I've already seen back home. Which is why, and the good thing is like, when you are using external examples, you don't have so much at stake, so you don't feel shame or guilt or like all these like messy emotions when you're like trying to self-reflect. Or sort of like try to see like, oh, this is how racism works, or this is how it, sort of this marginalization takes place. I think it gives you a bit of space to like, not have these like messy emotions, but then sort of like slowly come back to sort of see your own set of experiences and sort of reflect. So, I mean, I just find it a very beautiful, beautiful tool.
Well, thank you so much, Shreya, and we're so honored that you were able to join us all the way from Tunisia today. And we thank you all for attending. We have just a couple last announcements. And, from your conversations, we would love to, we'll be doing this kind of reflection exercise all week. And we'd love for you to type an aha moment that you had from today's session, or something really clicked with you, or something you found really interesting, something that you think you might want to include with in the classes you teach, or something that just came from the conversations you had in your small groups. We'd love for you to just take a quick moment and think about if you had any aha moments during Shreya's presentation. We'll just pause for a few minutes here. Well, as you continue ruminating on your what you took away from today's session. I will go ahead. I believe this is the link to today's attendance form. I've put that in the chat for you. I want to share a little bit more about our consortium and the resources that we offer. So we thank Shreya so much for giving this presentation on our behalf. Shreya is an affiliated member, a grad student of the Duke UNC Consortium for Middle East Studies. And we are a collaboration between the Middle East Studies programs at UNC-Chapel Hill and at Duke University. And we provide resources for our students and faculty and librarians and staff on campus to learn more about the Middle East. But we also provide opportunities and programs to help educators learn more about the Middle East and North Africa and incorporate more content into their teaching. So we offer a variety of professional development opportunities, including short webinars such as this program, but we also offer long-term programs like fellowship programs. In more normal circumstances, we travel to the region with teachers, and so we'd love to see you at any of our upcoming programs. We also have a variety of online resources, and I will share our website with you in just a moment, and you're welcome to go there. I know in this age of online teaching, hybrid teaching, in-person teaching, we're not sure what the future will hold in terms of teaching, so we're thrilled to be able to share different resources for you related to the Middle East and North Africa, as well as teaching about Islam. Shreya also generously mentioned that she's happy to Skype or Zoom into your Google Meets into the classes that you teach. And so we do have an active speakers bureau. If you would like to have a speaker connect with your students on the Middle East and North Africa or Islam, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'll put my email in the chat in a moment. But we do have a lot of different opportunities for educators, and we encourage you, if you're interested in this part of the world, to stay in touch with us. So here is information about our consortium and how you can stay in touch. Our website is ncmideast.org/outreach. And you see our social media handles here, as well as my email. And we'd also like to thank the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction one more time, and encourage you, if you're in North Carolina, but even if you're not in North Carolina, to connect with NCDPI's Global Steering Committee and the many other opportunities and exciting programs they have in store for International Education Week.